Well, happy Sunday to you again. It's good to be with you and good to see so many of you. And again, for all of you that are joining us online, we're so glad that you are a part of us even at a distance. It's good to be connected and to be together again. Today is week 2. We're early on in our study of Matthew's gospel in our series entitled God With Us. If you want to go ahead and turn over with us to Matthew chapter 2, that's where we'll be this morning. And as you're turning, I'll give you a little bit of context and background for where we are and what we've covered so far. We talked about last week how the Gospels are themselves, really, it's probably best for us to not think of them as four diverging, completely universal accounts of Jesus, but rather are meant to be taken together in aggregate, sort of like we talked last week about how a prism can refract light and spread apart the colors of light, that each gospel is in many ways meditating on telling us something about the various colors of Jesus that when put together speak to the fullness, the greatness of our Lord and Savior. And so Matthew's gospel, where this gospel fits in the color of the rainbow, is that Matthew's overriding concern, his operating principle, his one big idea is that if you think of Jesus in only one way, if you learn only one thing of Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is Christ the King. That is essential for Matthew's understanding of Jesus. And so we'll talk more about that today, and then we'll really begin to kind of lay the groundwork for what's to come in Matthew's gospel. Matthew 1 and 2, chapters 1 and 2, function as the introduction to the gospel. So we're still in the introductory material both last week and this week, and then beginning in chapter 3, which we'll get to next week, we jump into the thick of things. Now, there's a couple other things to remember about Matthew's gospel and what Matthew's doing as he tells this story, this understanding that he brings to Jesus, is that the church, what we are together, the descendants of, the church is very, very important to Matthew, the only of the four Gospels to use the literal word church. And for Matthew, Jesus is in many ways the continuation, the fulfillment of the Old Testament ideals of a king. That he is, as we looked at last week, he is the descendant, he is the son of David, but he is the culmination. While David was great, David was on the Mount Rushmore of the Israelite people, David was still flawed. Even David, even Solomon were imperfect kings, and Christ the King, however, is the fulfillment of that promise of who David could have been. And so what we begin to see in the midst of this is that the church, the hands and feet of Christ, is critically important, and that Jesus not only is the king, but Jesus is the primary teacher. And in this way is not simply in line with just the kings of the Old Testament, but also the great teachers, the prophets. And as we'll talk about more as we get into some of his early teaching materials here over the next few weeks, he really comes to embody the ideal that Moses represented as well. That, remember, for Matthew and Matthew's audience being people that are Jewish Christians, this is incredibly important. And so church, teaching, discipleship, all provide and flow out of Christ's kingly identity. And that's what we'll talk about more this morning. So we talked last week, just one last reminder about how much of what chapter 1 is focusing on answering the question of who is Jesus. And so we see there that Jesus belongs, according to Matthew 1, not just as the Son of God, though that's incredibly important, but he's also the son of David. And so he belongs to two kingly lines. So he is king twice over. So if chapter 1 is answering the question of who, chapter 2 is answering the question of where. So this morning I'm going to read for us Matthew 2, 1 through 4, and then I'll pick us up in verse 13 and go out through the rest of the chapter, another 10 verses or so. But pay attention. We'll focus primarily, after we're done reading, on verses 1 through 4, but there's a few things I want to draw your attention to in the second half. But pay attention to the questions of where. Who is asking? Where? What are they hearing back in response? Who is asking? What are they hearing? And perhaps most important for us this morning, why are they asking? Why do they want to know where Jesus is? That's at the root of chapter 2 for us this morning. All right, enough of me talking. Let's go on to verses 1 through 4, and then I'll pick us up 13 through 23. This is Matthew chapter 2. It says, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" Here's verse 13. After the wise men were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother," the angel said. "Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." That night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. "I called my son out of Egypt." Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead. Now when Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. "Get up," the angel said. "Take the child and his mother back to the land of Israel, because those who are trying to kill the child are dead." So Joseph got up and returned to the land of Israel with Jesus and his mother. But when he learned that the new ruler of Judea was Herod's son Archelaus, he was afraid to go there. Then after being warned in a dream, he left for the region of Galilee. So the family went and lived in a town called Nazareth. This fulfilled what the prophets had said. He will be called a Nazarene. So I want to come back to those questions of where, who's asking them, why they're asking them, and what they're hearing in response. But before we do that, I want to pick up just a few details, the second half of the chapter. These will be important to us actually in the weeks to come, because Matthew again begins to lay out this framework for this 28-chapter gospel. This big story. It's incredibly important to Matthew that several of these elements begin to line up. And so he's sort of putting all the pieces in place. He's setting the table for us. And so I have to cheat a little bit and look ahead just a bit to connect some of the dots early on, but I don't want us to miss this going forward. So we'll come back here in just a second to those questions of where, because if you happen to notice, all the action in chapter 2, and for that matter, all of the big questions for us today come from those two questions of where. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about geography. Now, I personally love geography. I've told you this before. My one claim to fame was that I am the Moore Elementary 4th grade geography bee champion. You can still go there, and in some dusty corner of that elementary school, there is a plaque that has my little name on it. I won the geography bee, took the state test, bombed it horribly, never got to compete at the state level, but that was my one claim to fame. So I always loved geography. That was really cool. I got to, I don't know if for those of you that are of my particular age, if you ever remember some of the early learning software, but there's a particular game called ZipZap Map where you could boot it up. I don't think it was DOS. I think it was Windows 3.1 that you could load that into, get some diskettes out, and learn some maps. But I've always loved geography, and part of what I love about it is that in the biblical text, geography is very, very important. It's not simply a extraneous detail, but actually when the biblical authors draw our attention to geography, they're drawing our attention to deeper details. It's one of the ways that the biblical text flavors the story. It's like spices. It adds depth to the story. It adds context. It adds shading to it. And Matthew's gospel is no different. So I've got just a little bit of an overview for you. You can see it over my shoulder. That what happens in Matthew's gospel is that it's very important to Matthew for us to pay attention to the fact that Jesus is on the move. And that Jesus moves from Judea to Galilee back and forth. Now, why is this important? Why does this matter? Why is this not just one more detail? Well, this begins again. Matthew is introducing us to Christ the King. And so he wants us to know what kind of king he is. So in chapter 1, we get not one, remember, but two of Jesus' names. We get Yeshua, Joshua, Jesus. Yahweh saves, that is his name. But then he also receives his kingly name, his royal name, which harkens back to Isaiah 7, Emmanuel, God with us. That is his royal name. And so who Jesus is as king is one who saves. Yahweh saves. And this Savior is with us. Who Jesus is, chapter 1, begins to unfold. Where is exactly the same, that we already from chapter 1 to chapter 2 see this movement that we have gone from Judea, Bethlehem, the city of David in the south, down to Egypt. We'll talk about why that's important here in a second. And now back up to Galilee. Well, what's significant about that? Well, if we can remember back to our Israelite history, we remember that those two cities are in two different regions, which historically belong to what? Two different kingdoms. And so already Matthew is stressing out of his Jewish Christian identity, writing to his Jewish Christian audience. He says, pay attention. This is not a sectarian king. This is not a regional king. This is not just a king of the southern kingdom or a king of the northern kingdom. He begins to expand our imagination and say, this king, this Jesus, this Emmanuel is the king of all the Jewish people. All the covenant people are being regathered, are being redeemed, are being repaired through him. And throughout Matthew's gospel, he draws our attention to the fact that Jesus' ministry does not belong to just one kingdom, but belongs to the fullness, the culmination of all that was longed for and hoped for throughout the Old Testament. And so we can see that throughout Matthew's gospel, Jesus moves from Judea to Galilee, to Judea to Galilee, to where? To the ends of the earth. That just as all the way back in the Old Testament, God makes a covenant with Abraham, because remember, the genealogy of Jesus in chapter 1 goes how far back? To Abraham. He goes all the way back to Abraham, to the covenant where God says, I will make your descendants so numerous that you can't count them. I will give you this promised land, and most importantly for us, what's the third promise? That through you all people will be blessed. Already here in just a few short verses, Matthew is connecting us all the way back here to this covenant with Abraham. Jesus is the fulfillment. This is the king that we've been waiting for. And it just so happens that not only is Matthew expanding our understanding, that he's cutting off claims by people saying, that he's just a Judean. He's just concerned with the southern kingdom. No, that's not true. He grew up in Nazareth too. Well, it's just a northern kingdom guy, right? He doesn't care about us here in the south. No, not true, right? Say, well, that's kind of interesting, right? Maybe that's important at some level, but it seems a little bit like inside baseball, right? What does that have to do with me? Well, that's a part of why I think Matthew makes it critical for us to understand of Jesus' movement down into Egypt, into the land of exiles, into the land where there's a healthy Jewish community way back in antiquity. We know that. But we know there's also the time of where the Jewish people spent time in bondage together. And that it's important for us to recognize that even in Jesus' early days, here is Christ the King on the run. Here is Christ the King, not welcomed with open arms, but forced to flee as a refugee immigrant to a foreign country. That all of a sudden who this king isn't just this majestic, wealthy, powerful person that has nothing in common with anyone, but who is Christ the King? He's the son of a country carpenter from Nazareth that spent time as a refugee in another country, likely living in abject poverty, fleeing where he was born, his life at risk with nothing but the clothes on their back, whatever they could fit on that little donkey that they rode into Bethlehem on, right? That all of a sudden, again, just 2 chapters in, this image of Christ the King speaks to us even today. Matthew is very clear to say, look, Christ the King, this is maybe not the king that you thought you were going to get, but this is the king that you need. This is a king that can relate to you. This is a king not just of this group or that group, not just of this economic status or that, of these means and not those means. No, already within the early years of Jesus' life, he has experienced arguably the fullness of life experience before he's a teenager. That's critical for us in the coming weeks to understand that Christ the King, this identity of a king, and what for us is that much harder to understand. We live in a world, Matthew would have been shocked to know, where we don't have day-to-day experience with a king. That would be unimaginable for ancient Matthew to conceive of, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But Matthew's critical to give us these details to draw our attention to geography, and the geography will become more important over the coming weeks as we jump into the rest of Matthew is structured between action, where the miracles appear, and then a teaching section, and then it goes back and forth from action, movement, miracles to teaching. And it's structured in this back and forth manner, and the geography plays increasingly important roles for us. Spoiler alert, the Sermon on the Mount, that location is critical. Why? Because what else happens on a mountain? Abraham and Isaac is on a mountain. The 10 Commandments is on a mountain. Jesus' teaching is on a mountain. The crucifixion is on a mountain. Mountains are incredibly important in the biblical text, right? So we'll pay attention to the geography going forward in future weeks. So this is some of the background that's going on in chapter 2 that I don't want us to miss, because while it may not jump out off the page for us this morning, it begins to put some anchor points in. Over the next few weeks, we'll come back to this and say, Matthew prepared us for this. He offered us something. He sort of primed the pump for us and what the point is that he's trying to make. So I didn't want us to rush through this and pass that. But as I told you, I wanted to come back to the questions. Questions are where it's at, y'all, right? The Bible is deeply interested in questions. In fact, that's Jesus' favorite response to criticism, to attacks, to questions, is to ask more questions. So did you notice the questions? Let's go back to verses 1 through for this morning, because that's really where the, I think, opportunity and challenge is for us as we come face to face with Christ the King, even at his young age. So King Herod emerges real quickly. Let me give you some background on Herod. Herod's an interesting guy. We have good access to some information on Herod because he was crazy. So we can actually go back and read many of his contemporaries in the ancient world, including historians from the era, his contemporaries, as well as those immediately after, who he was such a, interesting is not really the right word. Crazy maybe not quite the right word either, but he was a complex, polarizing, important figure in the ancient world here, and lots of people told us about him. And so we'll talk about that here this morning, but we know that Herod passed away obviously early in Jesus' life, but Herod was a contemporary of Julius Caesar. His father was on such great relationships with Julius Caesar that Herod eventually came to power, he and his brother, because of that relationship, and he was kind of a partial governor, and then his relationship with Mark Antony continued, and that developed ultimately into this role as a king. He went actually as a governor to Rome asking for help for this uprising that was happening in Judea. This is, again, a few decades before Christ came, and people were so impressed with him in Rome that instead of helping him, the Senate voted to make him king and said, "You're king now, figure it out," and sent him back. And so he spent 3 or 4 years waging war in the area, trying to secure his hold as king. He was known as a great builder, a great consolidator of power, but he also is a deeply, deeply troubled, paranoid man. Deeply, deeply paranoid. So paranoid, in fact, that he had a debilitating illness that lasted several years, leading to his death, so he knew that his death was coming, and he ordered his sons and sister, who would eventually take over, his kingdom would be divided in Judea. Again, he was serving as a kind of vassal king for the Roman Empire. So he left his right-hand men and women. He was so paranoid, so consumed with what would happen of him, that he was so worried that when he died, nobody would mourn him. So he came up with a solution. He asked his sons and sister that when he died, together, the leading men of the area, he was in Jericho, he eventually died in Jericho, that he asked them to gather them together, the leading men of the region, and to kill them, so that there would be mourning at the same time as his own death. Yikes. Troubled, paranoid, consumed, right? And we see what? We see that emerging from the pages of Scripture. So Herod emerges here in verse 1. During the reign of King Herod, about that same time, wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where's the newborn king? Where is the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose. We've come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. Called a meeting of the priests and teachers. Where is this Messiah supposed to be born? And over the next few verses that we jumped over just to save a bit of time, many of us know the familiar story where, unable to find Jesus, the wise men, unwilling to cooperate, they sneak off a different way. They don't go back as loyal subjects, but rather loyal to Christ the King. Herod eventually goes back and kills all the boys, the little boys that would have fit in Jesus' peer group as an attempt to get rid of Christ the King. So here's where this intersects with us today. Again, Matthew's beginning to set the table for us, lay out lots and lots of connection points that we'll be picking up on in the weeks ahead. But this is where I think the challenge is for us this morning. Is I want to invite you and me too to pay attention to who's asking the questions. It's effectively the same question. Where is this Jesus? Tell me, where is this Jesus? Same question, right? But totally different motivation. Totally different motivation. That what's happening in the context of this story, the wise men, or perhaps you grew up being taught the magi, they were effectively, we don't know where exactly they were from, but they were effectively kingly servants. They were the court advisors. We don't know exactly how many there were. We tend to think by tradition that there were 3 because they had 3 different gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We don't really know how many there were. But here are these men, these professional advisors to kings, coming looking for Christ the King. And then there is King Herod also looking for Christ the King. And that in and of itself is an important distinction for us. That the motivation for those looking to serve the King is very different from the one who himself is a king. Think about that for a minute. Both asking the same question, both intent on finding this Jesus, but for 2 diametrically opposed reasons. Those who are looking, who've devoted their lives to serving the King, have totally different motivations than the one who sees himself, who spends his life as a king. This is critically important for us. Because the reality is nobody in the story denies that Jesus is a king. Did you notice that? Nobody says, I'm going to need to see some paperwork on this. I'm going to need to get some validation that you are who you say you are. It's not a question. Christ the King has come, and they are desperate to find him. One, so the magi, the advisors, the servants of the king can serve and worship him. The other, so that Herod can kill him. And the reality is that battle is the same battle you and I are fighting today. It's the same fight. You see, the thing that's interesting about Herod is that while he was a king of Israel, basically, let's just say that, he was a king of the Israel territory, there's always another king, right? He served at the pleasure of the emperor of Rome, the leaders of Rome. There's always another king, but in Herod's world, he was the king. And he was bent on doing anything, and that's not hyperbole, really doing anything to the point of killing 1- and 2-year-olds. Doing anything to remain king. Doing anything to remain king. Whereas, on the other hand, it is the wise men's desire effectively to have left their old kings, traveled into unknown lands, searching for someone they didn't know for sure was there, but committed, believing that there was a new king. You see, the challenge is for us, church, that we are having that same battle, that same struggle today. It's the same battle, in fact, that I'm having in a much different way with my 3-year-old at home. Perhaps some of you have fought this fight before. I recognize that I have quite a few children's stories. I have a backlog to share with you after a pandemic. That's really about my full life experience, right? After being home. That's really all I have to offer you from the last 2 or 3 months. But so my 3-year-old is about 3 and a half, and sometime over the last few months, we had a pretty important milestone in our house. That many of you know him, that he is incredibly verbal. My wife reminds me often that is because of me, that he gets that from me, but he's the kind of kid that loves to talk, but also loves to connect by talking. So he's the kind of kid where we could be sitting at the dinner table, and he'll just look at you and say, Dad, 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 Dad. literally looking right at him. Dad, Dad, Dad. Until you say, yes, Griffin. Okay, well, I just want to say, da, 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 right? He needs that connection. He needs that acknowledgement to connect in that way. But he loves to talk, and so often we ask him, hey, do you want to read a book, buddy? Or let's watch a show, or let's go outside. Yes, Dad, I'd love to do it. Let's go, let's go, let's go. Well, we hit this important moment where a couple of months ago, I looked at him and say, all right, bud, it's time for dinner. Let's go. And he looks back at me, he says, no. Totally casual, right? It's almost as if, this was, and I, say this jokingly, but this was effectively as if he had looked at me. I recognized, I knew that it was important, that something significant was happening. He effectively looked at me and said, I am the captain now, right? That's what he looked at me and said, no, I think I'm in charge now, right? I'm good. I don't really want to do dinner. Good playing here with my puzzles, my books, living my life, doing my thing. You go have dinner, Dad. I'm the captain now, right? Now, there's a part of that, of course, that's healthy and good over time, I'm told. Like sometime when they're 30, he can have his own agency in the world or do whatever, right? No, but there's a part of growing up that is healthy and good, but there's also a part of us that struggles immensely. Whether we are 3 or 63, with not being in control. Not being in control. And so we can look in our own lives and across our own stories to say, who are we going to be? Christ, the King, has come. The King is here. It's not open for debate. It's not open for dispute. Even Herod is not questioning it. But Herod is resisting it, isn't he? And so one of the great invitations of the gospel is the process of discipleship. Because really what much of the Christian journey is about doing the hard work, and it is hard work, of transforming our inner life to the point that we can accept a new king. That's what it's all about. Now, many of us would say to others, and particularly to ourselves, because I'm particularly good at lying to myself, right? To say, well, I'm not like that. Here I am, right? I've been a believer for this long. I've been in church for this long. I've been reading the Bible for this long. I've been listening to Christian radio for this long. Surely you're not talking about me. Why, yes. Yes, I am. Because I'm talking about me too. And so the reality is for us that we have more in common with someone like Herod than we care to admit. While we may not completely resist outright, there are inevitably, for many of us, portions of who we are, portions of our life where we resist the kingly lordship of Jesus Christ. Where we say, yeah, you know what, God? You can have my job. You can have my retirement. You can have my home. You can have my Sunday mornings. But you can't have my kids. You can't have my bank account. You can't have my job. You can't have my Saturdays on the lake. You can't have this. I'm still the captain over here. I'm still the king over here. I'm going to hold on to this. I am going to trust myself still with this. And so the challenge is for us, church. How do we become the kind of people that look more like the wise men and women, right? What a name. Wise men, wise women, people that trust in the kingship of Jesus Christ. Perhaps that's what makes them wise most of all. Or are we the people that will go to any length to keep Jesus' rule and reign at bay? That's the question for us this morning and in the weeks ahead. And that's what Matthew ends his introduction on, that the rest of the gospel, the rest of this gospel focused on the church, focused on the teaching, the training, the discipleship of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus. This is an exposition, a revelation of who this king is, and it is an invitation to a journey for us to discipleship and ultimately to the transformation of who we are. So that day by day, step by step, we become more and more able to allow the kingship of Jesus Christ to rule and reign in the fullness of our lives. So, I hope you come back next week. I hope you come back. I hope you stay tuned. I hope you're engaged in the series because that's what's at stake. That for Matthew, he says you can't understand Christ without the kingship. You can't understand what he wants to do, how he wants to save you, how he wants to change you, how he wants to redeem this world, how he wants to move you from brokenness to wholeness, unless you can get to a point where you can let your life have a king that isn't you. That's what the rest of the gospel is all about. So here's my challenge for you this week. This is my opportunity for you. Here we are at the introduction, right? What are we to do other than to keep reading, to keep traveling, to keep pressing into this? Well, here is my invitation for you, is to ask yourself those same questions that were being asked in chapter 2, that Matthew's gospel was asking. Take time this week. Maybe it's once this week, maybe it's once a day. Whatever this looks like for you, to ask yourself 2 questions. Where is God? Where is Jesus? Where is Christ the King in my life? And why do I care? Where is Christ the King in my life? Chances are, I would be willing to wager that Christ the King is poking, is knocking, is pressing into a place of your life that perhaps you hold on to pretty tightly. That's where I tend to find him most often in my life. Where is Christ the King in your life? And why do you care? Are you there ready and willing to invite him in? Are you saying, thank God someone can be king or queen besides me? Or are you sitting there saying, where is God pressing? Where is God challenging? Where is God pushing? And how do I get it to stop? How do I secure my kingdom? How do I hold on to what's important to me against the pressure of this king? Those questions are the invitation of chapter 2, and they will influence how each of us reads and experiences the gospel throughout the rest of these 28 chapters. We'll talk, I'll go ahead and invite our worship team back up as we get ready to wrap up our time in worship. I'll just give you a little taste of what's ahead. If this is an interesting conversation for you, an uncomfortable conversation for you, challenging conversation for you, what we'll begin to talk about in conjunction with Matthew's gospel is what does it look like for us as the people of God to do this work consistently? How do we do this work? How do we become the people that look less and less like Herod and more like wise men and wise women? This is long, difficult, detailed work. And luckily for us, there have been men and women, wise men and women throughout the 2,000 years of the church that have devoted their lives to finding ways to do the work of making their hearts more hospitable to Christ the King. So over these coming weeks as we travel through Matthew's gospel, that's the journey we'll be taking. not only to see Matthew's vision of who this king is, who really is the Savior, Yahweh saves, who really is God with us in our life. But why is this king trustworthy? What is this king going to do to us? What might this king ask from us? Matthew will lean into that. And we, in turn, will continue to talk about how we, as individuals, as families, as a faith family, craft a spiritual journey, a pilgrimage, aimed at transforming who we are to become more and more accepting, welcoming, desiring of Christ the King. I hope that's encouraging to you. I hope that's challenging for you. And I hope you'll be a part of that journey in the weeks ahead. We're getting ready here in just a moment to sing Waymaker, a reflection on the power of Christ the King. I hope as we pause and worship that you can begin to ask yourself those questions. God, where are you in the midst of this? Where are you pressing? Where are you knocking? Where are you asking to rule and reign in my life? But I hope too, as we get ready to stand and sing, that you can hear these words as an affirmation that this king is trustworthy and true. That this king is more than enough for whatever you need this morning. That this king can make a way where there isn't one. That's my hope for you today and in the days ahead. Let's stand together and worship.